Alright young lads, it's been a long time coming. Today, each and every single one of you will become men, and not just any men, but many men. Today, I say, is the day of reckoning. Today, hey you, get back in line. Today is the day of the PS5 hardware reveal. Listen, it won't be easy, it won't. But all I ask is that you open your mind so that we may see the future of gaming. It's beautiful. What is going on, guys? Let me start out by saying wow. Absolutely just wow. You know, when Sony first revealed the DualSense controller, as a lot of you guys might know, I wasn't the biggest fan of it for about 48 hours. But the thing quickly grew on me. Like, originally I thought the design was too boxy and honestly a bit too abstract looking to be a controller, but after staring at it for such a long time, my brain just started to like it, and I think a lot of people were in the exact same boat as I was. The reason I'm mentioning this is because when I first saw the controller, I instantly knew that the console would follow suit. I mean, it honestly wasn't that hard to piece together since most controllers typically resemble their parent console in one way or another. So when I looked at this thing, my first thought was, okay, so the PS5 is going to be white and futuristic, and lo and behold, it absolutely is. So at the time, the question then became, what kind of futuristic would it look like? Rounded, smooth, sharp? I didn't know, but I did know to keep my mind open to make sure I wasn't initially disappointed in the same way that I was when the DualSense controller was revealed. And again, I'm saying this because there seems to be quite a few people, though not the majority, who don't really like the design. And I mean, yeah, you have a point, it is a bit abstract, but I'd say give it a day or two, open up your mind, and I'm sure it might grow on you. But my opening spiel defending the console aside, let's get to why I'm making this video. A quick little theory I have on the PS5's cooling mechanism. Now, I know what a lot of you guys are gonna say. Hey innocents, there was a leak for a patent of a PS5 heatsink. There was also a leak for a dev kit's cooling solution. And I know, but I'm not gonna be talking about those because it's obvious that they're far outdated. I mean, for Pete's sake, this PS5 heatsink patent was filed in 2018 and was only recently discovered. And trust me, I think a lot of things could change in the development process over the course of 2 years. And as for the leak of the dev kit cooling solution, in my humble opinion, it's almost entirely useless to us. Because in case you guys didn't know how dev kits work, they are usually a bit more powerful than the consumer version of the system, i.e. the one that you're going to see on store shelves later this year. And you might be like, why is that? Well, that's because they are exactly what they sound like, developmental kits. They are given to game developers across the world so that they can begin developing PS5 games, not testing how quiet they can make it run. So because of this, dev kits usually have much beefier cooling systems that are more lazily thrown together in hopes of keeping things as cool as possible for developers, regardless of noise level. And now you might be like, you're telling me that the developers have been making games for something that technically isn't a PS5? I mean, you said it's probably more powerful than an actual PS5 and also has better but less efficient cooling. So how in the hell are these games they're developing supposed to run on a real PS5? And well, you're asking some great questions, really, but there's a simple answer to that too. Numbers. What usually happens is a console creator like Sony provides developers with a certain list of numbers containing things like power constraints, frequency constraints, voltage constraints, current constraints, heat failure thresholds, and a bunch of other things that are indicative of the final version of the PS5. So when developers are off making their art, they simply monitor all of these factors and make sure that the final product of their game lies within the designated constraints laid out by Sony. So, you know, when they actually ship it out, it can actually run on a real PS5. But they never actually quote unquote develop a game for a consumer PS5, they just make sure that it'll run. And this is because the final version of the PS5 just doesn't have enough horsepower to do all the stability testing that they want. So now you're wondering, okay, so then what is the overall point to the concept of dev kits then? And why does it matter? Well, they really serve two purposes. Number one, like I mentioned above, they allow developers to let their creativity roam free with extra horsepower, then compromise where they have to later. This often means that the dev kit has more powerful components as well as better internal cooling, which is why I'm trying to discredit looking at the dev kit to get a hint at the final cooling solution, as they will most likely be completely different from one another. And the second reason is to basically hide the look of the final product from any potential leakers, because let's be serious, the PS5 dev kit got leaked into oblivion. A lot of people seem to be under the assumption that studios like Naughty Dog, Insomniac, or Guerrilla Games knew what the final console looked like a long time ago. I mean, it's a pretty reasonable assumption. They are Sony's personal studios, right? Wrong. When it comes to big reveals like this, even the developers didn't know how the final console would look like and were most likely watching the stream right along with you to find out for themselves. Yeah, that's right, the lead director of God of War 2018 was probably watching the exact same stream you were yesterday, so feel special. I presume that the only people who knew about the final look of the console were Mark Cerny, the people who designed it, and maybe the CEO of Sony North America, and that's it. That's how tight-lipped this was. And all of that just goes to show that the cooling solution of the dev kit is most likely not important, which is why I won't be discussing it here. Now, there's gonna be some of you who are like, did he really just spend 2 minutes explaining why he wasn't going to explain something? And yes, I did, because I knew there was gonna be tons of people in the comments saying, we have a look at the PS5's cooling solution when we don't. The dev kit is irrelevant. But now, I'm sure you guys are tired of waiting, so let's actually talk about why I think the PS5 might be Sony's cooling running console yet. It's mainly because of 2 reasons. Reason number 1, the PS5 will most likely take advantage of vapor chamber cooling. And the reason that's important is because it will offer significant cooling advantages to what the PS4 Pro is currently using, which we could all admit could do a better job. And admittedly, Microsoft has been taking advantage of at least some stripped back form of vapor chamber cooling since the release of the Xbox One X, and has even brought it over in full form in the Xbox Series X. The PS4 Pro, however, still heavily relied on traditional cooling methods, which is one of the reasons it was as loud as it was. But that also means that it's almost a guarantee, though technically not confirmed, that the PS5 will introduce vapor chamber cooling into the family, which will allow the system to run cooler than it ever has. And this is the part where you ask, how does vapor chamber cooling work? Great question, let's blaze through that real quick. So basically, it's in the name. Vapor chamber. As you guys know, there are 3 states of matter: solid, liquid, and vapor, or gas. Well, technically there's 4, but they don't really mention plasma until you get to higher level physics. Anyways, we know that a vapor chamber will involve vapor or gases in some way, as well as a chamber. And that's exactly what it is, just a copper encasement that has liquid coolant in it, and this encasement is placed into direct contact with whatever needs to be cooled, in this situation presumably the PS5's processor and GPU. How it works is, whenever the processor produces heat, it will generate enough of it to essentially boil some of the liquid trapped within the vapor chamber, and that liquid will then become vapor or gas. And as you know, gas is much lighter than liquid is, so it will rise to the top of the chamber, similar to how the water at the bottom of a boiling pot is what is becoming water vapor and rises to the top of the pot in the form of bubbles. Essentially, the same thing is happening within the chamber. The heat produced by the processor will boil away the liquid and it will rise to the top, but unlike your boiling pot, this liquid has nowhere to go and is trapped once it reaches the ceiling. But not all hope is lost. Once it reaches the top, the vapor will then be met by cool air, presumably being brought in by the PS5's fan, where it will then be cooled to below its boiling point, condense back into a liquid, and fall back down to the bottom of the vapor chamber, creating a sort of never-ending cycle as long as the PS5 is on. And vapor chambers also don't look like this. They look more like this, and their interiors look more like this. But the concept I've explained to you is 100% accurate in how they work, albeit a bit simplified. So now you know what a vapor chamber is, but another question comes up. How exactly does this cool the PS5? And to answer that, you must know that there are 3 main forms of energy transfer: radiation, conduction, and convection. And vapor chambers basically manipulate convection to transfer heat energy away from the processor and into the air. I'm sure you guys know what radiation is if you've ever felt the sun. It's basically a form of energy transfer that uses waves on the electromagnetic spectrum to send out energy through the air. In the case of the sun and the PS5's processor, this electromagnetic radiation is generated by the thermal motion of particles within the matter itself, and are sent out as these particles try to slow down and cool themselves off, essentially shaking away their heat, so to speak. But as you may have guessed, radiation is a really inefficient way to cool something off. Sure, over time you are radiating away a decent amount of heat, but time is your enemy here. Using this method to cool the PS5 would be the equivalent of just leaving the processor out to be cooled by the surrounding air, which obviously wouldn't work. Which brings us to the second type of energy transfer, conduction. And how conduction works is pretty straightforward. It involves the transfer of energy through direct contact of matter. So unlike radiation, which essentially vibrates its heat energy into the air, conduction vibrates its heat energy directly into something else. Fun fact, conduction is the energy transfer method your PS4 uses to dissipate its heat. And not just your PS4, but a lot of your modern electronics like the processor of the computer you're using to watch this video right now. Conduction also happens to be a lot more effective at transferring energy than radiation, and if you want to test this for yourself, which I must legally say I do not advise you do this, simply put your hand near something hot and take note of the amount of energy you feel radiating away from it. Then take your hand and put it into direct contact with that heat source. Notice how you're getting a lot more of that heat energy and at a much faster rate. And conduction can be likened to the heat pipes modern processor coolers use today, which are usually kept in direct contact with the processor and kept cool by several fans so that they could continuously conduct heat away from said processor. And then comes the third type of energy transfer, which also happens to be the most efficient and is used in, you guessed it, vapor chambers. I'm talking about convection. Now, convection operates on one simple principle, that fluids like gas or liquids could carry energy. And if enough of this energy is transferred into a fluid, it will change state and carry the energy with it as it rises until it cools. And as it cools, the energy is transferred even farther away from the source as it is swept away by a condensing material. And this material, usually air, strips enough energy away from the fluid that it condenses, causing it to fall back down. This is also how rain works. The sun heats up the earth and causes water to evaporate, and the vapor will rise until it reaches a height where it is able to be cooled by the barren upper heights of the troposphere, where it then condenses into a cloud and eventually rains back down, starting the cycle all over again. And vapor chambers essentially try to recreate this phenomena in order to keep your console cool, and they do a pretty damn good job at it too. But anyway, that was reason number one as to why the PS5 will run cooler than ever, again if Sony decides to take advantage of vapor chamber cooling technology, which I'm pretty sure they will. Now on to the second and final reason, which Mark Cerny actually discussed quite a bit at Sony's online GDC conference, so we're gonna need to take a step back in time for this one, but don't worry about it, it will be worth it. Getting straight into it, the PS5 will fundamentally change how your console thinks about cooling, and that is no exaggeration. Traditionally speaking, game consoles have used a simple concept to cool themselves, and that is using the level of power consumption to dictate how much cooling or fan speed needs to be applied to any given component. Because remember, the main goal of cooling is to carry heat energy away from the processor and into the air as fast as possible. So with an old console, that is done by regulating how much power the console is consuming at any given point, because if you know how much power something is consuming, you can then mathematically figure out how much heat energy will be generated by the law of conservation of energy. So basically, knowing how much power your console is pulling will allow you to know exactly how much heat energy you need to dissipate, and we've used this little shortcut to cool game consoles for ages. Mainly by simply guessing how much power a game scene will consume at its peak and letting the console's fans roar for the entire duration of said scene to prepare for the worst case scenario. But as you might have noticed, there's a slight problem with this method, and it's that a lot of the times the fans will be working in overdrive when they don't have to, simply because they're waiting for that worst case scenario to come, even if it might never happen. You see, consoles today use a fluctuation of power and steady processor usage for any given scene, but like I just mentioned, the fans will always run at whatever speed they need to in order to prepare for the worst case of heat that might occur. But again, since power is always fluctuating, sometimes your fans will often be loud for quite literally no reason. However, the PS5 has switched it up quite a bit and decided that instead of running the processor at a steady state and fluctuating power in order to run more intensive games, what if it runs power consumption at a steady state and fluctuates the processor usage instead? Well, that's what Sony's variable boost clocks are all about. They will allow for the complete predictability of power consumptions, which will then in turn make the PS5 infinitely easier to cool than it's ever been, since the energy that needs to be dissipated will always be known. The PS5's fans won't ever work when they don't have to, and they also won't ever rev up to maximum speed unless the game developer allows for that to happen behind the scene. But if a developer decides that a quiet cinematic scene is more important than having multiple assets loaded in, with PS5, that's now an artistic choice that they can make, which was not possible in the past. Essentially, with this method, the PS5's fan speeds will be 100% predictable and in fact mainly controlled by the game developers themselves, instead of letting them roam free on their own like in the past. Pretty damn cool if you ask me. No pun intended. Actually, all puns intended. Still, the steady power variable processor speed is not without its limits, however, and these limits mainly come in the form of throttling the processor or making it slower whenever it starts to use up its power allowance, so to speak. And this could technically manifest in games as slightly longer loading times or slightly longer asset streaming, or maybe even a couple minute dips in frame rate. Sony does claim that this will rarely happen and will only ever occur in the absolute worst case scenarios that should be few and far between. And honestly, this is how PC GPUs and processors have been operating for decades now, so in my opinion as a PC player, I'd say I wouldn't let this small downside get to you too much. It sounds a lot worse than it is and really doesn't happen too often at all. And there you have it, the two reasons why I believe the PS5 might be Sony's cooling running console yet, its potential and all but confirmed vapor chamber, as well as its variable clock speed. So guys, that's pretty much gonna bring us to the end of the video. Well, there's actually one more thing that I wanted to point out, and it's the fact that the air exhausts for the console seem to be located at at the top, if you couldn't tell already. But in all the 360 rotating of the damn thing, I didn't manage to spot any air intakes. And this means one of two things. Either one of the exhausts located at the top of the console is actually an intake, or the intakes are located at the bottom of the console, or maybe on the front end towards the bottom, which would produce a very similar airflow path to the Xbox Series X surprisingly. Just something that I noticed that I thought was relatively interesting. Anyways, that's truly it, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down below in the comments and I'll try to get to as many as I can. With that being said, if you liked the video, leave a like. If you disliked the dislike, and consider subscribing for more gaming content. I post all sorts of things here, so you'll be bound to find something that you enjoy. Alright guys, I've been the Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.